welcome to episode 5 of the Zesty Dietitian Podcast. I'm your host, McKenzie Caldwell, registered dietitian. This episode, we are going to be jumping into the carnivore diet. This is something that I actually get asked about a lot, even though it sounds a little bit crazy. It is really popular right now. I get everybody from 55-year-old men to my brothers to my female patients asking me about the carnivore diet. So I'm excited to jump into it and talk more about what it is, why it's popular, and what my thoughts on it are. This episode is sponsored by our one-on-one nutrition coaching program here at Features Zest Nutrition and Wellness. We are a team of weight-inclusive registered dietitian nutritionists that specialize in fertility and pregnancy and helping you have a healthy relationship with food in your body overall while you are nourishing it for fertility and pregnancy. My team dietitians, Natalie and Kristen, are amazing, and we absolutely love working with folks one-on-one to help them nourish their bodies fully. If you are interested in one-on-one nutrition coaching, you can head to our website, which is www.feedyourzest.com, and you can follow the directions there on applying to work with us for nutrition counseling. So without further ado, let's jump into the carnivore diet and all of my thoughts on it. So first things first, what is the carnivore diet? The carnivore diet is a diet that involves eating only animal products and particularly almost entirely only meat. There's different variations that you'll see. Some people will also include milk, cheese, and yogurt. Other people say, no, those are too high carb, and we don't include those. Some people will eat fruits. Some people won't. Some people will include dark green leafy vegetables, and some people won't. So there's definitely a lot of different variation out there. But in essence, it is a diet that pretty much is almost entirely only meat products. So let's just start off with the TLDL, the too long didn't listen to this podcast. Is this actually good for fertility? And the short answer is no. It's not good for fertility, and it's not good for human health in general for a wide variety of different reasons. The short reason is that, number one, humans are omnivores. An omnivore is a creature that consumes all different types of foods, from fruits and vegetables to roots and seeds and nuts and all of the things, insects even. And we have seen that throughout human history. We have always eaten all of those different types of foods. We see that we have evolved as a species to have teeth, digestive enzymes, digestive tracts. We have evolved anatomically to eat all different types of foods, both plant-based and animal-based overall. And that is literally just a fact. There's a cool exhibit in the Natural History Museum in Washington, D.C. that I like, that shows kind of like the evolution of the human digestive tract and how it eventually has evolved to handle meat, but originally was pretty much almost entirely meant to digest plants because that was what we could get. That's what we could forage most efficiently. From then, we have actually been able to do research and seen that time and time again, the vast majority of scientific research on human nutrition supports the idea that the consumption of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes, in addition to animal foods, is beneficial for general well-being, as well as both male and female fertility. So why is the carnivore diet even popular in the first place? Like, what the heck is going on? There's a really good episode of the podcast Maintenance Phase that I recommend that dives into the history of the carnivore diet, and especially kind of how it is wrapped around this interesting character named Jordan Peterson. They do such a great deep dive, so I'm not going to fully get into it, but a little bit of an overview. In 2018, Jordan Peterson was interviewed on Joe Rogan's podcast. And even at the time, I mean, Joe Rogan is huge, but 2018, he was also huge. I don't know how many listeners he had in 2018 compared to now, but a lot. And Jordan Peterson preaches the carnivore diet based on personal experience. He's a psychologist, and he's a problematic individual for a wide variety of reasons. But that is probably what made the carnivore diet the most popular. There were rumblings about it on the internet before 2018, but that's kind of what made it explode. Because the Joe Rogan podcast attracts a lot of men with kind of a little bit more right-wing, conservative-leaning ideologies, that's who the carnivore diet is most popular among. Like a lot of other diets, it offers a sense of community and belonging. It helps people have a sense that they're kind of doing something quote unquote right. It helps them feel pure or like better than thou. That's something that we see with vegans, with vegetarian, like people who don't eat sugar. It's very much something that people can latch onto. That is a sense of control. A lot of people describe that being on any sort of diet gives them some sort of high, and that can really warp their perspective of whether a diet is right for them mentally and physically. So on top of that, there really could be short-term improvements in blood glucose for those that maybe had diabetes, and then all of a sudden you're cutting out carbs. Of course, your blood sugar is going to be a little bit lower. That doesn't necessarily mean that in the long term it's the healthiest for you, or that's the only way to do that. And then for those who have inflammatory bowel disease, this could potentially lead to short-term symptom relief, because we do see that when people with IBD, which is Crohn's or ulcerative colitis, when they're having a flare-up, a lot of fiber can actually not be great, and it can cause a lot of GI irritation for those folks. Those are a very specific subset of people that might benefit in the short term from cutting out fruits and vegetables and other sources of fiber. And again, that's in the short term. It's not something we would want to continue in the long term. We also see that there's something called the placebo effect, which is essentially when you take a medication or do something for your health and well-being, if you think that it's going to work, then sometimes we actually do see a very small benefit from that. So when we're doing medication trials, we'll give two different people, two different sets of pills. One will just be like sugar pills, like it'll have nothing in it. And the other one will actually be the drug that has the supposed benefit. And we will see, and then maybe sometimes they'll have people do nothing. We'll actually sometimes see a benefit for the people that take the placebo, the sugar pill, just because there's some sort of psychological benefit to this idea, like, oh, I'm doing something for myself, therefore it will work. It's really interesting. I've listened to a podcast on the placebo effect, and I'm forgetting the name of it, and I'll link it in the show notes if I can remember it. But it exists, and it's always something we need to remember and consider when we are looking at the impact of a diet and its supposed benefits for our well-being or our fertility. So why is the carnivore diet specifically gaining popularity for fertility? So there's multiple people, multiple voices in the fertility world that are talking about carnivore diet or low carb approaches and things like that. But the carnivore diet specifically, there's one particular doctor who has a very loud and very big platform. And his name is Dr. Robert Kiltz. He is a reproductive endocrinologist and the founder of CNY Fertility, which is originally based in upstate New York. And it's popular because they offer a lot of really low cost options for fertility treatments, including IVF. That's about like a third the cost of what you might be able to get at a different clinic, which is important. In addition, there's some people that report that certain CNY fertility clinics either have no BMI limit or they are very liberal with their BMI limits for treatment, which is also important in providing access to care in people of all size bodies. I've heard a lot of different feedback. I have had some patients that have gotten treatment from CNY Fertility, and I've had people report mixed outcomes. So I'm not going to comment on whether or not it's a good fertility clinic or not. Those are just facts and things that they state on their website. Dr. Kiltz himself has over 75,000 YouTube subscribers, over 200K Instagram followers, and over 70K TikTok followers. He also has a blog with a lot of stuff on it. And a lot of what I'll quote in this podcast is actually like written by somebody else, but it's on his blog. It may or may not have been reviewed by him directly. And then he also has a podcast, and he's had a couple books be published as well. So let's talk specifically about the carnivore diet and why Dr. Kiltz promotes it and how he got into it. So I found an interview that Dr. Kiltz did with a YouTuber in 2022. And the YouTuber goes by Steak and Butter Gal. She also eats carnivore, and that's what she promotes on her platforms. In that interview, Dr. Kiltz reports that he had many health issues throughout his life. And then in his like early 50s, he's now, I think in the interview, he said he's 66, and that was 2 years ago. So he's probably closer to 68 now. In his early 50s, he discovered paleo and keto and kind of just started to dabble in those and noticed a little bit of improvement in some of his health issues. And then in his mid 50s, he was quote unquote watching some guy that was carnivore. I'm assuming that's like on Instagram or YouTube or something, who appeared lean, fit, and healthy. And he then decided to try the carnivore diet himself. He reports that his symptoms disappeared within a month of eating a carnivore diet. And so he decided to look into it more. And then he began writing blogs and books about it, wanting to share his experience with the world, and then started promoting it to his patients in his fertility clinic as a reproductive endocrinologist. The interview is linked in the show notes if you do want to listen to this because you're curious. I'm going to warn you though, or just put a major trigger warning here, because the podcast does describe a lot of very extreme and disordered eating behaviors that could be really, really triggering for people with disordered eating. So just putting that there. I'm going to talk about some of the main points in this podcast if you want to kind of have somebody filter it for you. Big thing to note is that Dr. Kiltz did not discover the carnivore diet through evidence-based research. He did not like go to a conference and hear a research group talk about the carnivore diet and then go from there. He was already kind of exploring a diet rabbit hole with the paleo keto world and eventually stumbled upon this carnivore influencer. Much like a lot of other people discover the keto diet, interestingly. And so it's really important to note that anecdotal evidence or the stories that people share about their experiences doing a certain diet, that is not research. Anecdotal evidence and stories are not research. It's not something that we really should be relying on as practitioners to inform the entire basis of our recommendations to patients. But I digress. Let's get into it. Dr. Kiltz promotes a diet that he calls babies. It's an acronym BEBBIS for babies. Bacon, eggs, butter, beef, ice cream, intermittent fasting, and salts. That's BEBBIIS. His blog claims that this diet is rich in all the nutrients necessary for reproduction and good human health and helps people avoid plant toxins like phytoestrogens, quote unquote, anti-nutrients, or these are also known as plant compounds that bind nutrients, as well as seed oils, bacteria, and excess carbohydrates. In the aforementioned YouTube interview, Dr. Kiltz claims that variety is not healthy and that we should eat the same thing almost every day like animals do, but that a little treat here and there is okay, hence the ice cream, which he does say is okay to make with a little bit of white sugar. He also claims that this is quote unquote super simple and easy to follow. I don't know if I agree with that. Okay. In his interview with Steak and Butter Gal, Dr. Kiltz claims that quote unquote any exercise is deadly because it heats the body and that folks should get off the bike and get off the treadmill. However, if you actually look on his blog, you won't find that exact statement anywhere. Instead, you'll see more promotion of low intensity exercise like walking, yoga, and swimming instead, which is a lot more neutral and palatable. He also shared his exercise or quote unquote motion routine on YouTube, which includes a cycling warm up. And in his, he calls it his motion studio. It's essentially a really nice home gym. There's a treadmill in his home gym. And then there's an article, a blog on his website that that's all about like why you aren't losing weight, 6 reasons you aren't losing weight on the carnivore diet or something like that. And lists one reason being that you might not be moving enough. So if you're confused, don't worry, because I am too. It's a little all over the place. Interestingly, I have noticed that many influencers who promote low carb diets are against cardio exercise. And so this is kind of a little bit of a conspiracy theory that I have, is that humans require adequate carbohydrates in order to fuel appropriately for activity. So if you're not eating enough carbs, you're going to feel like absolute shit if you then try to exercise. And so I think that therefore a lot of people who are just adamant that keto or the carnivore diet or whatever is the right thing to do for everybody, that's why they're going to then somehow start to make claims that cardio exercise is bad for you. Anyways, let's debunk the carnivore diet and just all of the things that Dr. Kiltz is promoting. So first of all, the vast majority of human nutrition research shows that variety is extremely important, plant and animal foods included. Every food offers a different set of nutrients, and time again, the research shows that a varied diet helps humans get enough nutrients and all types of those nutrients. And that varied diet also helps promote healthy gut microbiome, or healthy gut bacteria. On top of this, varied cooking methods help with the bioavailability of different nutrients. So bioavailability is how well we can digest and absorb a certain nutrient from a food. So some foods have a higher bioavailability of some nutrients compared to others. While quote unquote anti-nutrients such as lectins and phytates do exist, and to an extent, they can inhibit nutrient absorption, or to a certain extent, they can be not ideal for human health in excess, when consumed in excess. Cooking decreases the activity or completely neutralizes phytates and lectins, depending on kind of what those cooking methods are and to what extent. And that allows us to absorb those essential nutrients from fruits and vegetables. On top of that, though, we see that in many plant foods, we can still absorb a lot of the nutrition from them despite any phytates that might be active in there. And some nutrients might even be lost or destroyed with cooking. So one example being spinach retains more lutein, which is kind of a carotenoid, and vitamin C when it's eaten raw. But we absorb more beta carotene, which is another carotenoid, from cooked spinach. So not only is variety in the types of foods that we eat important, variety in cooking method is also really important too. Okay, and then let's talk about phytoestrogens. So for whatever reason, phytoestrogens are referred to as a quote unquote anti-nutrient in a lot of Dr. Kiltz's language, and I'm assuming probably in like elsewhere on the internet as well. I didn't look that deep into it. But they're not actually super harmful. In fact, phytoestrogens can actually be beneficial to human health. So a phytoestrogen is a plant compound that can mimic human estrogen. But in moderate amounts, it's not actually harmful. They can be beneficial. Phytoestrogens are found in foods like soybeans and flax seeds. And when we consume them in their whole form, so for example, that might be tofu, tempeh, edamame, or like ground flaxseed or whole flax seeds, they act like a more gentle form of estrogen in our bodies. This provides a gentle estrogen boost to those with low estrogen, maybe those who have hypothalamic amenorrhea or are in perimenopause or going through menopause. But they can actually also help with symptoms of estrogen dominance for those with endometriosis, fibroids, or PMDD, because they can actually bind the estrogen receptors on our cells and therefore keep any excessive natural estrogen at bay and keeps it from being able to then cause the kind of downstream cascade that happens after a hormone usually binds its receptor, which is super interesting and super cool. We also see that the consumption of whole soy foods is associated with a reduced risk of certain estrogen sensitive cancers, certain breast cancers and uterine cancers. And on the other hand, when consumed in excess, highly processed soy protein isolates have the opposite effect, which is really, really interesting. And most likely the reason for this is because in the processing, the phytoestrogens probably kind of are included with the soy protein isolates, and then they get even more concentrated, and that concentration is just a little bit too much on our bodies, again, when consumed in excess. So eating like one Cliff Bar with soy protein isolates is not going to kill you. But maybe if we are choosing a protein powder to keep on hand, maybe soy protein isolate might not be the best one to eat every single day. So it's really interesting. Anyways, that's my soy phytoestrogen spiel. There's definitely some nuance there, and phytoestrogens are not across the board bad. And in fact, we actually have pretty strong evidence that in moderation, they can be good for us. Okay, bacterial contamination. Like, I'm sorry, food safety is important across the board, even when it comes to animal products. Bacterial contamination is going to be a risk no matter what you eat. In fact, our biggest foodborne illness outbreaks in 2024 have been in deli meats and queso fresco, which are both animal products. So I think that's all I have to say about that. Okay, moving on. Next, let's talk about seed oils. Seed oils are really misunderstood. A solid amount of research shows that a standard American eating pattern does have too much omega-6 fatty acids and not enough omega-3 fatty acids. So let me explain what that is. Both omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids are polyunsaturated fats, or PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids. A saturated fat is a chain of carbons. It's got little hydrogen molecules on the outside of it, but it's a chain of carbons that does not have any double bonds. And so it's like just a little zigzag. Whereas in unsaturated fat or polyunsaturated fat or monounsaturated fat is going to have double bonds somewhere in it. So polyunsaturated fat is going to have at least one double bond. And the omega-3 or omega-6 designation is telling us where is that first double bond. Is it on the third bond or is it on the sixth bond? Omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids have different roles in our bodies. Omega-6 fatty acids are essential to human life just as much as omega-3 fatty acids are. Omega-6 fatty acids, we need them for cell structure and clotting. And omega-3 fats, we need them to help fight inflammation. They actually act on the same pathway that aspirin does in the kind of anti-inflammatory cascade, which is really, really interesting. We cannot make omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids on our own. So we have to get them from our diet or we will die. That is a fact of life. That is what makes them essential. Saturated fats are also important, and they help to provide some structure to our cell membranes as well, alongside omega-6 fatty acids. And then monounsaturated fats, so they have one double bond in their little chain. They seem to offer anti-inflammatory benefits similar to omega-3 polyunsaturated fats. But the difference is that our bodies can make on their own both saturated and monounsaturated fats. Super cool, right? So fatty acid metabolism is actually really, really complex. This was one of the hardest parts of my biochemistry, nutritional biochemistry training that I received in both undergrad at Cornell and graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill. Fatty acid metabolism is a lot. And there's a lot that we just don't know and that we're not super clear on. There's new research all the time on different types of saturated and unsaturated fats that makes it really hard to make definitive statements or conclusions about whether saturated fat is good or PUFAs are bad or whatever. On top of this, all categories of fat are found in both plant and animal foods. So you will find both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in beef. And you will also find both omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids in olive oil. And you will find saturated fat in coconut oil. And you will find saturated fat in butter. They're everywhere. What we do know right now is that for the standard American, it's not hard to get enough omega-6 fatty acids or saturated fats, but it does take a little bit more effort to get enough omega-3 and monounsaturated fats to see some of the heart health benefits and anti-inflammatory benefits that we see popping up that are associated with increased consumption of these two types of fatty acids or categories of fatty acids. So eating more sources of omega-3s and monounsaturated fatty acids like olives, avocados, nuts, seeds, and oily fish seems to be beneficial for long-term health and well-being as well as fertility. You will not eat too much omega-6 fats if you are focusing on those omega-3 plant foods or monounsaturated rich plant foods. Whether or not saturated fat is harmful for fertility is really not an easy answer. And it probably depends both on the type and quantity of saturated fat that we're talking about. There's something called palmitic fatty acids. There's oleic fatty acids. Those are both different types of saturated fats, and they do different things in our bodies. There's probably a role that individual genetics has to play here. One really big epidemiological study called the Nurses' Health Study found that women who ate full-fat dairy over the course of their life, they followed these women for like decades. It found that those women had lower rates of irregular ovulation and infertility compared to women who ate low-fat or skim dairy. And so full-fat dairy is a source of saturated fat, but it's not necessarily going to be the same types of saturated fat that we might find in like bacon or something like that. And then another study showed that full-fat dairy improved live birth rates among women receiving IVF treatment. There's been other research on type 2 diabetes and full-fat dairy. Lots of stuff out there. Essentially, we're seeing that the saturated fat from dairy might not act on our cholesterol and our heart health and all these other disease outcomes that we're concerned about. It might not act the same way as saturated fat from other sources. So for that reason, I do not actually recommend avoiding full-fat dairy products, but instead incorporating them as long as it works for your body, like you're not allergic to dairy. Of course, please don't eat dairy if you're allergic to it. And that it fits with your ethics. If you feel like ethically dairy doesn't fit into your eating pattern, that's okay. I want to support you in that. If you do have genetically high cholesterol or a family history of heart disease, and that's making you really worried about saturated fat, there are other methods to take care of your cardiovascular system without avoiding full-fat dairy or avoiding red meat. That is probably one of the only things that Dr. Kiltz and I like maybe kind of sort of agree on like a very surface level. Anyways, so that's my saturated fat and fat spiel overall. Ultimately, one of the only facts that is almost indisputable in human nutrition science is that adequate fruit and vegetable consumption is helpful for almost every health metric. We see this pop up over and over and over and over again. It's boring, right? We know this, and nobody wants to hear that fruits and vegetables are good for you because it just doesn't make the headlines go viral. But that's a fact. This does have to do with their vitamin and mineral content. And a lot of people will say like, oh, well, I don't need the folate from dark green leafy vegetables because I can get it from liver. Like, okay, yes, there's folate in liver and there's iron in beef and red meat and liver and things like that. But there's other stuff in plant foods that is important too. So their health benefits probably have a lot to do with their fiber and antioxidant components. Fiber is crucial to blood sugar, cholesterol, and hormone health, and it's extremely important for your digestive health, including a healthy gut microbiome and making sure that we can reduce your risk of colon cancer in the long term. In addition to fruits and vegetables, fiber is also found in whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes. All of those are plant foods. We cannot find fiber in animal foods. If you're curious about what an antioxidant is and what it does and how it helps fight inflammation, you can listen to my podcast on inflammation, which is episode 1 of the Zesty Dietitian Podcast. So to sum it all up, what I tell my patients when we're going over foods to add for fertility and pregnancy is this. If you take away nothing else from seeing me as a dietitian, besides the fact that eating enough fruits and vegetables is important, my work as a dietitian is done. Like, I'll be fine. There's, of course, so much more that we can do besides eating enough fruits and vegetables, especially if we're trying to individualize things to you and your life. But if, like, I don't know, I just decide to not be a dietitian anymore, or you don't have access to a dietitian anymore, and that's all you hear, adding in more fruits and vegetables generally is going to be really beneficial for your long-term well-being and your fertility. Of course, it is 1000% possible to eat too many fruits and vegetables. This can limit the amount of essential proteins and fats that you're able to get in purely by way of volume. We can only fit so much food in our stomach at one time. And this can also cause a lot of GI distress, a lot of stomach cramping, constipation, and or diarrhea, just from eating too much fiber. That absolutely is possible. And this is especially true for those that are recovering from hypothalamic amenorrhea. If they find that a lot of what they have been doing is over consuming fruits and vegetables, if they reduce their fruit and veggie consumption to something that's a little bit more moderate and regular, this is going to help them have the capacity to get in enough carbs, enough fats, enough protein in order to be able to get their period back and fully recover their fertility. For those with Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, this might also be true. An IBD flare, like I talked about earlier, is often going to call for a break from fiber until things calm down, but we almost always will try to help those people reincorporate fiber in a way that works for them because it does have long-term health benefits. And then those with IBS or irritable bowel syndrome, which is different than IBD, which is inflammatory bowel disease, they might not necessarily be able to tolerate all fruits and vegetables in any quantity that they want all the time because they might have difficulty digesting certain types of carbohydrates. But that doesn't mean that they have to avoid all fruits and vegetables, period. Especially if they struggle with constipation. Like you need fiber and you need water and you need to eat consistently throughout the day. And there's psychological mechanisms involved as well. But like cutting out fruits and vegetables is not the answer if you have IBS. And then I have had a couple patients who've had gastroparesis, which is when your stomach just digests really, really slowly for whatever reason. And those folks might have difficulty tolerating adequate fiber, might need to like very slowly work up what they're able to tolerate, or potentially might need a fiber supplement that passes the stomach, so that they can have good colon health without irritating the stomach. It's a little bit complex, but ultimately I have seen patients in practice with all of the conditions that I just mentioned. It is absolutely not the norm. And I still am going to always recommend a more varied diet. But with some creativity, I have been able to help these patients eat adequate fruits and vegetables and still get pregnant naturally. That's a fact. Finally, the idea that like we need to cut out carbs is just like it's the bane of my existence as a dietitian, honestly. And I will die on this hill that we do not need to cut out carbs to get pregnant or have a healthy pregnancy or manage PCOS or lower your A1C. Like you just absolutely do not need to do that. The body's primary source of energy is glucose, and we get this from eating carbohydrates. We can get this from fats and from proteins in our food. It just is not efficient. It takes a lot longer for our bodies to be able to get our blood sugar up and stable if we're not having carbohydrates or enough carbohydrates. Cutting out carbs also limits our consumption of nutrient and fiber dense foods, which I just talked about. If we're not eating enough carbs, we're inherently going to be limiting all of those other really, really important foods from our diet. We absolutely do not have to cut out carbs to have balanced blood sugar, and we can choose fiber-rich carbs as well as pair them with protein and fat in order to balance blood sugar overall. And we can get a lot of anti-inflammatory benefits from those foods that happen to also have carbohydrates in them. I'll likely do at some point a different episode on vegan or vegetarian diets for fertility and pregnancy, because I absolutely do think that a healthy pregnancy is possible on a plant-based eating pattern. I always want to help my patients eat according to their values, especially when their personal morals or ethics are part of that value system. That said, animal products are nutrient dense, and I do believe that they are an important part of a fertility promoting eating pattern if that fits with your ethics. So for those that are ethically okay with animal products, I think that they are helpful to include, and I'm going to help my patients figure out how to include them. Animal protein is very easily used by the human body. Eating animal products is the only way to naturally get vitamin B12. You're on a vegan or vegetarian diet, you will likely need a B12 supplement in order to get enough, especially if you're taking any sort of drug that might inhibit your B12 absorption or metabolism. And then animal sources of iron are also more easily digestible and absorbable as well. That does not then, though, mean that plants are not nutritious. That's got to be, it's some sort of logical fallacy to say that. I don't know which one, but it's just not true. Animal products are nutritious and plant products are nutritious, period. Okay, let's talk briefly about intermittent fasting. Pretty much all of the research on intermittent fasting has been done on men. And so I can't 100% speak to whether or not it is necessary or beneficial for male fertility. Maybe I'll look into that at some point, but the few studies that have been done on intermittent fasting in women of reproductive age actually show an increase in cortisol. And if you've listened to my first podcast episode on cortisol and inflammation, you'll know that that is not a good thing. We need consistent caloric intake throughout the day, and going long times without food is really stressful on the body and is absolutely not ideal. It is not something that I recommend. In addition, I find that a lot of folks who practice intermittent fasting or the one meal a day kind of pattern of eating will end up in a binge restrict pattern, which then means that they then have a really hard time trusting themselves and trusting their bodies, and have a lot of difficulty in mindfully adding in nutrient dense foods. It also just makes it a lot more difficult to fuel for activity if you're an active person, which I don't know, we're confused, I guess, about what Dr. Kiltz thinks about physical activity, but let's just dive into that. I think it's clear that Dr. Kiltz was wrong to say that exercise is bad across the board in that podcast interview, and he's probably said it other times in social media or on his YouTube channel or whatever, because he just straight up contradicts himself, which is super frustrating. But it is absolutely a fact that overtraining can harm fertility. He's not wrong to say that. But what quote unquote overtraining is going to depend on how fueled you are, your personal physical health and ability, and your ability to safely exercise. It's also probably going to have something to do with your genetics, and every person's capacity for physical activity is going to vary. In general, 150 minutes per week of moderate physical activity. So moderate being you feel like a little bit out of breath, so you wouldn't be able to sing, but you could still have a short conversation. So 150 minutes of moderate physical activity, or 75 minutes if it's more intense, up to that point where you could only speak in short sentences, has so many health benefits. We see that in the research really strongly, these associations with that kind of moderate physical activity or shorter durations of higher intensity physical activity, we see mental and physical benefits. And then in addition to that, having strength training twice a week, we see that that helps with bone health in the long term. That helps with your metabolism. It helps you be an old person who can get off the toilet and be independent by themselves. So many health benefits. And that's why that's what the CDC recommends. These are CDC guidelines. So yeah, that giant organization that gives us all of the guidelines for human health in the United States. That's what they recommend because that is what is based in evidence. Movement is just straight up beneficial for mental and physical well-being, for fertility and for pregnancy outcomes as well, when it's done safely and in moderation. My podcast episode with physical therapist Dr. Colleen Connolly dives a little bit more into physical activity as well as pelvic floor PT. So if you want to learn more, you can listen to that. Some folks with hypothalamic amenorrhea might need to take a little bit of a break from exercise, or just really seriously pull back on exercise until their period is recovered. But no one should be scared to mindfully add it back in. Listen to your body. ask for help if you need it, and you will find an exercise routine that is healthy and right for you specifically. Ultimately, the carnivore diet is not based in solid evidence. Despite Dr. Kiltz's blog citing a study from quote unquote Harvard and Rivero, this study is not well done research, no pun intended. Someone put out a Google form on social media, a researcher, I guess, who's into the carnivore diet, put out a form on social media, and then people responded. So this is like somebody who already has that bias of, hey, I like the carnivore diet and I'm doing research on it, and all of my followers also like the carnivore diet. Fill out this form. So we already have some bias in the type of participants who are doing the carnivore diet. They're going to want to participate in a survey, and they're going to have a certain amount of bias going into that study, which is just like not good methodology. It's not good. It's not a like sound recruitment method for a research study. So that's already flawed. We also know that self-report bias is unfortunately really strong and doesn't help us get good evidence from our research. And that's just because people don't always tell the truth, unfortunately, especially if they know that the study that they're responding to is going to be used to further the point of view that they have going into that. So essentially that study is like, yes, it's large. I guess they say like they had 11,000 people respond to it and they took like a sample of 2,000 people. That's a big study. Yeah, it is. But whether or not it's a good study is not, it is, I guess it's up for debate, but I don't think it's a good study in my professional opinion as a dietitian with Master of Public Health degree. Dr. Kiltz does not cite any other studies on the carnivore diet on his blog, just that one. And it's not a good one. So that said, in my opinion, the carnivore diet just does not have the evidence base to be promoted as something that should be done for fertility. I'm sure that there have been anecdotes of people who have seen their fertility improve by being on the carnivore diet. I've had a patient in the past who was on the carnivore diet as well, but there were a lot of kind of disordered eating tendencies wrapped up in that case. And that said, like anecdotes are not evidence. So it's not something that I, as an evidence-based dietitian, am going to recommend across the board because it does not scientifically make sense. So what does work for fertility? Most of the research on nutrition fertility points to a quote unquote Mediterranean style eating pattern. I'm putting Mediterranean in quotes because the Mediterranean region of the world is extremely diverse in cuisine. We have like Italy and North Africa and Lebanon and Southern France. Like there's a lot of variation in exactly what that looks like. And so it's kind of a misnomer and a little bit more like, I don't know, this white guy researcher dude was like, oh, the people on this one island off the coast of Italy that have a bunch of centenarians, they eat like this, and we're just going to call this diet that. Like, okay, whatever. It's a misnomer. But again, I'm putting it in quotes because this eating pattern can fit any cuisine across the globe because it's really just a pattern of eating that has different food groups that we can find anywhere. The quote-unquote pro-fertility diet is an eating pattern that is growing in popularity among evidence-based practitioners as it combines research on the classic quote-unquote Mediterranean diet, which is high in olive oil, seafood, whole grains, fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds. It's combining that research with what we're seeing on the link between full-fat dairy and fertility, on eggs and fertility, dark green leafy vegetables and fertility. So that's kind of where I land a little bit when I am working with my patients one-on-one and we're individualizing an eating pattern that works well for them and their needs and their preferences and their cultural cuisine. We're going to kind of end up in that pro-fertility diet kind of pattern. But I like to focus on having my patients add in those nutrient-dense foods for fertility versus seeing it as a super strict diet that they have to stick to and that they can't have anything else to eat, or that if they eat anything not on the list, that's bad or whatever. And that is really, really important to me as somebody who struggled with disordered eating myself. And I work with people who have or have had eating disorders in the past. And on top of that, the evidence shows us that when we promote a really strict eating pattern, it's not sustainable, despite the carnivore diet being quote unquote simple and easy to follow. Is it actually? I disagree. I don't think it is. And I would much rather have my patients kind of working towards an eating pattern that they're actually going to be able to stick to, not just right now while they're trying to conceive, but something you can stick to for the rest of their lives. So that's kind of my take on what does work for fertility nutrition. Wow. This was longer than I expected it to be. I hope you found this information helpful and that you feel like it's something that you can incorporate into your life as you fuel your body for fertility or pregnancy or just your reproductive health across the board. If you would like support in finding an eating pattern that supports fertility without restriction, apply today for one-on-one coaching with Feed Your Zest dietitians. We would absolutely love to support you and cannot wait to get started. So with that, take care and have a lovely day.